The United States Declaration of Independence mentions three inalienable rights. Life and liberty seem fairly intuitive, but the pursuit of happiness seems a bit more vague and subjective. In reality, it refers to a specific way of being described by Aristotle around 350 BC and painstakingly developed by many others over the 2,000 years that followed. It gives rise to a particular meaning of life and liberty, and is the end goal behind both the Declaration and the Constitution. It insists on a particular view of morality, government, economics, and society unfamiliar to many Americans. Our departure from that view explains much of the turmoil facing our nation today. Increasingly, we are a people with a morality, or software, incompatible with the structures, or hardware, our nation was founded on. In this essay, I explore the lost meaning of the pursuit of happiness. A curious choice. When Thomas Jefferson penned the Declaration of Independence, he originally wrote life, liberty, and the pursuit of property as being among our inalienable rights. The revising committee, Benjamin Franklin some suspect, then changed the last of these to the pursuit of happiness. A curious, nice-sounding, albeit ambiguous choice. What does it mean? Why does it rank up there, alongside life and liberty? How does it relate to property, if at all? Jefferson and the other founders never offered an explicit explanation, and scholars have debated over its origin and meaning for the past 2.5 centuries. Today, an inquiring citizen might turn to Google to explore its meaning. When I did so, I got the following top 10 results, most of which coincide with the notion that everyone gets to individually decide what happiness means for them. The first result was a Wikipedia article suggesting that the phrase was copied from contemporary authors such as John Locke, George Mason, Adam Ferguson, Richard Cumberland, or William Wollaston. The second entry was a Your Dictionary entry defining it as the right to, quote, freely pursue joy and live life in a way that makes you happy as long as you don't do anything illegal or violate the rights of others, end quote. The third result was a schmoop.com entry that states that it is, quote, going after things that make us happy, whether it's chicken farming, basket weaving, or stamp collecting. Jefferson thinks we should have a chance to chase our dreams, end quote. The fourth result was an Emory University article lamenting that the modern thin understanding that the pursuit of happiness is a hedonistic one and advocates for a thicker interpretation that it is instead a state of being, the good or flourishing life, and should be a primary concern of government, which should ensure health, safety, food, and medicine as a few important building blocks of a happy life that governments can address. The fifth result was from the pursuitofhappiness.org site, which argued that Jefferson may have been channeling the great ancient Greek philosopher Epicurus, who spoke of happiness as pleasure in the sense of the absence of pain in the body and trouble in the soul, sober reasoning, searching out the grounds of choice and avoidance, and banishing those beliefs that lead to the tumult of the soul. The sixth result was from a How Stuff Works article that declared, quote, if there's one thing that can be said about happiness, it's that it's wholly and utterly subjective. What makes one person happy, picking flowers on a sunny day perhaps, may make another person decidedly unhappy, end quote. It then discussed John Locke's belief that happiness is the natural state of humanity as a response to the forces of pleasure and pain, to which responses vary by individual. Several paragraphs are then dedicated to the idea that, quote, the accumulation of wealth is a major source of pleasure for Americans, end quote, before closing with, when he wrote the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson avoided defining happiness, choosing to leave it to the individual to determine his or her own meaning of the word, end quote. The seventh result was from a 2011 article in The Atlantic, which referenced Aristotle, saying, quote, that happiness was the goal of human activity. For him, true happiness was something more than simply eat, drink, and be merry, or even the honor of high position. Real satisfaction didn't depend on the pleasures of the senses or what others thought of you. You could find genuine happiness only in a life of virtue and just actions. President Kennedy alluded to Aristotle when he defined happiness as the full use of one's talents along the lines of excellence. End quote. The article then went on to share that both Washington and Jefferson believed happiness was attained, at least partially, through the good that you did in public, and further opined that people were happy when they controlled their destiny, when their voice was heard, when they participated in public events, when the government did not do things to them or even for them, but with them. The author then closes with, the only thoughtful discussions of the true meaning of happiness and prosperity will awaken people to what it is that really fulfills them and will give them the words to describe it. The eighth result was a brief page on the Monticello.org website that simply stated that, quote, Jefferson never explained his use of the phrase pursuit of happiness, but that he was almost certainly influenced by George Mason's Virginia Declaration of Rights. The ninth result was a December 2011 article published by the William and Mary Law School expressing agreement with efforts by Charles Maurice Wilkes in 1935 to trace the origins of the Happiness Clause through John Locke, Francis Hutchinson, Joseph Priestley, Caesar Beccaria, Jeremy Bentham, and others. Wilkes concluded, quote, the happiness principle is undoubtedly the most significant feature of Jefferson's theory of rights, for it raises government above the mere negative function of securing the individual against the encroachment of others. By recognizing a right to the pursuit of happiness, the state is committed to aid its citizen in the constructive task of obtaining their desires, whatever they may be. It should also be noted that this principle is universal, and therein is distinct from the hedonistic maxim of Bentham. The state is to secure not merely the greatest happiness of the greatest number, but so far as possible the greatest happiness of all its citizens, whatever their condition. It may well mean, therefore, that many will be restrained from achieving the maximum of happiness, that others less fortunate may obtain more than the maximum. No one will get all he wants, perhaps, but so far as the power of the state can go, everyone will get something. End quote. And also within that article, Wilkes noted that the happiness principle is not only the most significant feature of the Declaration, but that it also embodies a theory of government. The 10th result was a 1964 article published in the William and Mary Quarterly, authored by William N. Schlesinger, distinguishing between the pursuing happiness and practicing happiness, like one might practice medicine or law, opining that the latter was the more correct, and then broke it down as follows. First, James Otis, in The Rights of the British Colonies Asserted and Proved, written in Boston in 1764, wrote that the duty of government is, quote, above all things to provide for the security, the quiet, and the happy enjoyment of life, liberty, and property, end quote. Second, Josiah Quincy, Jr., in Observations on the Act of Parliament commonly called the Boston Port Bill, written also in Boston in 1774, avowed that the proper object of civil society is, quote, the greatest happiness of the greatest number, where he was citing Marquis Beccaria in an essay on crimes and punishment from Italy, 1767, which was in turn thought to be original to Jeremy Bentham in his explication of utilitarianism. Third, James Wilson, in Considerations on the Nature and Extent of the Legislative Authority of the British Parliament, written in Philadelphia in 1774, asserted that, quote, the happiness of the society is the first law of every government, end quote. Fifth, John Adams, in Thoughts on Government, written in Philadelphia 1776, quote, the happiness of society is the end of government, end quote. He also wrote, quote, we ought to consider what is the end of government before we determine which is the best form. Upon this point, all speculative politicians will agree that the happiness of society is the end of government, as all divines and moral philosophers will agree that the happiness of the individual is the end of man. From this principle it will follow that the form of government, which communicates ease, comfort, security, or in one word, happiness to the greatest number of persons, and in the greatest degree is the best. And a second quote from John Adams, all sober inquiries after truth, ancient and modern, pagan and Christian, have declared that the happiness of man, as well as his dignity, consists in virtue. Confucius, Zoroaster, Socrates, Mohammed, not to mention authorities really sacred, have agreed on this. End quote. As we see, a wide range of ideas exists on the subject. Only 2 or 3 of the top 10 even get remotely close to the understanding that Jefferson and the founders had of the now famous phrase. A conversation with Aristotle. Several of these top 10 sources mention in passing that Jefferson never explained his meaning of the famous phrase, pursuit of happiness. But is that really true? In a letter to Henry Lee, written in 1825, Thomas Jefferson, who studied Greek from the age of 9, wrote, quote, "The object of the Declaration of Independence was intended to be an expression of the American mind. All its authority rests then on the harmonizing sentiments of the day, whether expressed in conversation, in letters, printed essays, or in the elementary books of public right, as Aristotle, Cicero, Locke, Sidney, etc." End quote. So what were the harmonizing sentiments of the day regarding the pursuit of happiness? What did the authors Jefferson had studied since his youth have to say on the matter? It turns out that Aristotle, the famed Greek philosopher who lived 2,300 years ago, devoted an entire book to defining the pursuit of happiness called Nicomachean Ethics, or Ethics for short. Nicomachus was the name of Aristotle's father, and the name Aristotle gave to his own son. If we were to have an interview with Aristotle today about this book, it might go something like this. And this is my attempt to consolidate many, many pages of dense and wonderful prose by Aristotle into a short dialogue. Question. Mr. Aristotle, what is happiness? Happiness is the greatest good and the end of human nature. It is the best, noblest, and most pleasant thing in the world. It is perfect, prized, and divine. Everything else we do as a mean towards happiness. And how does one obtain happiness? One attains happiness through the realization and perfect exercise of virtue. And what is virtue? Virtues are states of character which make a man good and make him do his work well. Each virtue is a choice, a mean, positioned between 2 vices, an excess on the one hand and a deficiency on the other. And what does that mean? Courage, for example, is a virtue. One of a dozen or so I explore in ethics. An excess of courage is rashness. A deficiency of courage is cowardice. Perfect virtue means acting in the right way, at the right time, towards the right people, all the time, for your whole life. Is that even possible? It is difficult in the extreme. Happiness is a journey or pursuit more than a destination. Actual goodness is rare, laudable, and noble. Our passions lead us astray constantly, and the less virtuously we act, the more difficult it becomes to attempt to return to virtue. How are we supposed to know what's right or virtuous? Each of us is born with an internal guide that gets us started. I suspect it is of divine origin. I call it reason, or right rule. But from there it must be developed, studied, learned, and practiced, made into habit and a way of life. Isn't happiness the same as pleasure? No. Well, in the final evaluation, happiness is pleasurable in a sense, but the path is often filled with pain and always contains challenges, requiring us to strain every nerve. The precisely virtuous choice is often difficult to discern in the moment, let alone practice. To make matters more difficult, we humans find pleasure in both the good and the bad, so pleasure cannot be our guide. Instead, we must practice virtue. So you define happiness as the pursuit of virtue by listening to this inner voice and practicing over a lifetime, developing virtuous habits that make up our character. And this brings happiness? Yes, and there's a bit more to it. A complete life consists of four things. First, living a life of virtue and justice. Second, developing practical judgment, that is, a knowledge of things that change. Third, attaining wisdom, that is, a knowledge of things that don't change. And fourth, acquiring sufficient property to sustain life and, ideally, allow for generosity and magnanimity. Wait, happiness is dependent on property? Yes, as mortal beings we are sustained by our labor. The good or happy man is a good steward over his property because he wants to use it to sustain his own life and help others in the right way, at the right time, an impulse desperately needed in all societies throughout all of history, wouldn't you agree? And that said, a truly good, noble, and happy man will bear with dignity whatever fortune sends him. A virtuous character leads to property, not the other way around. So property is necessary to a complete life and to the fullest sense of happiness. So happiness isn't subjective? Don't each of us get to decide for ourselves what makes us happy? Yes and no. Happiness comes by acting in accordance with an external standard, virtue, as determined through an internal guide given at birth, reason, which we cultivate and practice throughout our lives, and which all other men are able to rightly judge, more or less, as to the rightness or wrongness of our action. However, we have many choices in who we associate with, who we marry, what career we pursue, what activities bring us pleasure, etc. But our actions in regard to those choices always have a right way, right time, virtuous aspect to them. A duty, if you will. At least they do if you want to be happy. So, the pursuit of happiness is really the pursuit of virtue in accordance with right reason. Yes, right reason is something inside each of us that guides us. It helps us navigate the nuance of acting virtuously in any given situation. Pursued long enough, it builds a virtuous character. This leads to happiness, the best thing in the world. It is the most God-like. God-like? Yes, the life of the gods is entirely blessed. Happiness is the closest we can approach that state in this life. I suspect happiness itself is God-given. In any case, it appears to be the wish of the gods that we approach this same state as much as we possibly can in this life. They seem to wish happiness for us. Wait, are you saying that the pursuit of happiness is really the pursuit of godliness? Yes, you could say that. I mean, at least the gods as I know them. As long as your gods, or even your own highest wishes, coincide with the desire for the greatest good, our pursuit of happiness should share the same ideals and methods. In any case, it requires a great deal of contemplation, internal reflection on who we are and how we should act. Is there anything else we should know about the pursuit of happiness? Well, obviously these ideas have broad implications for child rearing, education, friendship, the arts, community life, citizenship, jurisprudence, helping the poor, the role of the state, etc. Justice, by the way, is the greatest of the virtues because it is acting with complete virtue, not only towards yourself, but towards all of your neighbors. I believe that the state has an important role to play in helping its citizens be virtuous and ensuring justice. And you can read more about that in my next book entitled Politics. That concludes the conversation between our interviewer and Aristotle. The next section I've entitled Greek, Roman, and Christian Influences on Liberty. So, dear reader, according to Aristotle, the pursuit of happiness is why we are all here. It is the greatest good. The path consists of the lifelong pursuit of virtue and the character it eventually builds. It requires listening to the internal voice given to all men at birth that tells us what is right and what is wrong. It leads to the accumulation and disposition of property to support oneself and benefit others. It leads to friendships of virtue, the highest kind of friendship, and a source of great pleasure. Those friendships are often crucial to healthy societies. It leads to justice, acting in the right way to all people at all times in the right amount. That's my attempt at summarizing Aristotle's words in our modern vernacular. In a moment, for those interested, we'll take a look at his actual words. Before that, it's important to note the impact that Aristotle's writing had on other writers and philosophers up through the American founding. Jefferson and his contemporaries were familiar with Aristotle, studying his writings in the original Greek. Jefferson specifically references Aristotle as one of 4 writers from whom he derived his ideas for the Declaration. Aristotle wrote a companion book to ethics called Politics, where he discussed ideas on how to implement his vision for the pursuit of happiness at the family and government levels. Cicero built on Aristotle's idea of reason in his concept of true law. As time progressed, these Greek and Roman ideas found a powerful ally in Christianity. Thinkers like Aquinas, Hooker, Locke, and Sidney made the case that individuals are free to combine into society as equals, not subjects. They delegate their right of self-defense that flows from being the creation and property of God. They came to believe that the government's only legitimate purpose was the protection of life, liberty, and property, as that is the only right we can delegate without unjustly imposing on others, impairing our pursuit of virtue, and thereby undermining our own pursuit of happiness. Divine will and the pursuit of happiness dictated that they must be maximally free so they can pursue virtue, including being the means of generously responding to the needs of their fellow man. All other social goods, besides the protection of life, liberty, and property, were to be brought about by men and women collaborating together voluntarily to solve society's problems as they sought to act rightly towards everyone within their community. Freedom of conscience, speech, assembly, the press, etc., are derived not only from man's individual sovereignty, but also from the idea that the ideal society, or utopia, is unachievable by man on earth. It is reserved for heaven or a government led by God himself. As such, mankind should only hope to achieve compromise rather than consensus on conflicting opinions, which requires the skills of critical thinking, reason, and debate. The pursuit of happiness is not, therefore, as some have come to believe, an open-ended, everyone decides for themselves philosophy. This idea of America expects something very specific from its citizens, and intends for them to be maximally free in order to achieve that end. In other words, maximum freedom requires maximum responsibility to act in a certain way, a virtuous way. This understanding of happiness and the liberty or open society necessary to pursue it sheds light on why founder and second president John Adams said, "Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other." Liberal, to be or not to be. These ideas form the basis of classic liberalism and roughly characterized American political theory for the first 100 years of the nation's history. The nation's second century was dominated by progressive liberalism, which expands the role of government to do coercively what classical liberalism and virtue ethics would have citizens do cooperatively. Well-intentioned, this perspective inadvertently impedes a citizen's pursuit of happiness. Instead of placing the full weight of societal improvement on individual action aimed at collective collaboration, it largely delegates that responsibility to the administrative state. Under the founding model, society's problems are solved by we the people. Under progressivism, they are solved by they the government. Citizens feel virtuous by advocating that government solve problems, but need develop little of the character, skills, and relationships that come from the hard work of cooperating with their neighbors to resolve issues at the local level. At worst, they become siloed and indifferent to the plight of the people actually living around them, focused only on their own interests, well-being, and prosperity. For the first 200 years or more of America's history, these two ideas formed the basis of our nation's political parties. In the last 50 years or so, the progressive perspective has increasingly characterized the policy positions of both parties. Large government programs that siphon enormous amounts of money to citizens and corporations, resulting in tremendous debts and future liabilities now totaling $200 trillion, or over $600,000 for each man, woman, and child alive in America today. Now, a third illiberal worldview seeks to displace the other two liberal views, known by several names: wokeism, radical individualism, identity politics, and identity Marxism, among others. It replaces the pursuit of happiness with the pursuit of social justice, which is a very different kind of justice than the one spoken of by Aristotle, and creates a very different kind of citizen, culture, and form of government. Understanding the differences between these three worldviews may be aided by noting how each views the role of government related to equality, for example. Under classic liberalism, the purpose of government is equality under the law. Under progressive liberalism, the purpose of government is equality of opportunity. And under identity Marxism, the purpose of government is equality of outcome. I intend to treat those subjects in greater depth in future essays. This concludes this essay. For those interested, I'll provide a few key quotes from Aristotle's Ethics and Politics related to the points summarized earlier. I encourage everyone to read both books in their entirety. They are lengthy and difficult, but well worth the effort. Aristotle, in his own words, on the subject of happiness, the greatest good and the end of human nature. Quote, "Happiness is the realization and perfect exercise of virtue." End quote. That's from Politics, Book 7. This one is from Ethics, Book 1, Chapter 7. "Now such a thing, the chief good or final ends, happiness, above all else, is held to be, for this we choose always for itself and never for the sake of something else, but honor, pleasure, reason, and every virtue we choose, indeed for themselves, for if nothing resulted from them we should still choose each of them, but we choose them also for the sake of happiness, judging that by means of them we shall be happy. Happiness, then, is something final and self-sufficient and is the end of action. Happiness is the chief good." That's from Ethics, Book 1, Chapter 7. "Virtuous activities, or their opposites, are what constitute happiness or the reverse." From Ethics, Book 1, Chapter 10. From the same book and chapter, "He is happy who is active in accordance with complete virtue throughout a complete life." From Book 1, Chapter 12, "Happiness is prized and perfect and a first principle, for it is for the sake of this that we do all that we do. And the first principle and cause of goods is, we claim, something prized and divine." From Ethics, Book 1, Chapter 12. And from Chapter 13, "Happiness is an activity of soul in accordance with perfect virtue." Also from Chapter 13, "By human virtue we mean not that of the body, but that of the soul, and happiness also we call an activity of the soul." From Ethics, Book 10, Chapter 6, "Happiness is the end of human nature." From the same chapter, "The happy life is thought to be virtuous. Now a virtuous life requires exertion, and does not consist in amusement." And from Ethics, Book 1, Chapter 8, "Happiness then is the best, noblest, and most pleasant thing in the world." The next section is on virtue, the path to happiness. And the next several quotes are related to virtue as a state of character. From Ethics, Book 2, Chapter 5, "Virtues are states of character." From Chapter 6, "The virtue of man will be the state of character which makes a man good and which makes him do his own work well." Same book and chapter. "Virtue, then, is a state of character concerned with choice, lying in a mean between two vices, the excess and the defect." From Politics, Book 1, Chapter 2, "For man, when perfected, is the best of animals, but when separated from law and justice, he is the worst of all, since armed injustice is the more dangerous, and he is equipped at birth with arms, meant to be used by intelligence and virtue, which he may use for the worst ends. Wherefore, if he have not virtue, he is the most unholy and most savage of animals, and the most full of lust and gluttony." The next section is on virtue as the mean, or as the mean between a deficiency and an excess. And here I'm just going to list the virtues that Aristotle lists in Ethics, along with the deficiency and the excess. So first, the mean, or the virtue, is courage. The deficiency is cowardice. The excess is rashness. And Aristotle refers to courage as being keen in the moment but quiet beforehand. One form of courage is civil disobedience. Cowardice can be an ignorance of danger. Rashness could be a wish for dangers beforehand but draw back when they are in them. Second virtue is temperance, in pleasure seeking. Deficiency is insensibility, which is rare. But the excess is self-indulgence, which is anything but rare. And Aristotle states, quote, "He craves for all pleasant things, or those that are most pleasant, and is led by his appetite to choose these at the cost of everything else. Hence he is pained both when he fails to get them and when he is merely craving for them, for appetite involves pain," end quote. Third virtue is liberality, which is generosity in small sums, giving to the right people, the right amounts, at the right times. The deficiency is meanness, and the excess is prodigality. The fourth virtue is magnificence, which is generosity with large sums. They're tasteful, fitting, liberal, gladly and lavishly given. They seek the most beautiful and becoming result. Magnificence. I think, was that magnificence or magnanimity? I think that was actually magnanimity. The deficiency is niggardliness. The excess is tastelessness or vulgarity, which is showy expenditure in the wrong circumstances and the wrong manner. The next virtue is proper pride. The deficiency is undue humility, and the excess is empty vanity. The next virtue is being honorable, having proper ambition. The deficiency is being unambitious, and the excess is undue ambition. The next is good temper. The deficiency being ineradicable, which is overindulgent, is not angered when anger is appropriate. And the excess is irascibility, which is being easily angered. The next virtue is being praiseworthy. The deficiency being blameworthy, and the excess being blameworthy. The next virtue is truthfulness. The deficiency being mock modesty, and the excess being when one is a boaster. The next virtue is being ready-witted, where the deficiency is being a bore, and the excess is being a buffoon. The next virtue is friendliness, with the deficiency being surliness, and the excess being a flatterer. The next virtue is modesty. The deficiency is bashfulness, and the excess is shamelessness. And the final virtue towards oneself is righteous indignation, with the deficiency being spite and the excess being envy. And then regarding others, the virtue is justice, which is complete virtue in relation to your neighbor. It's the greatest of virtue. Aristotle says, quote, "Complete virtue in its fullest sense, because it is the actual exercise of complete virtue, not only in himself, but towards his neighbor also," end quote. And the deficiency is sins of omission, and the excess is sins of commission. The next section is on the difficulty of virtue. This is from Ethics, Book 2, Chapter 9. Moral virtue is a mean between two vices, the one involving excess and the other deficiency. Hence also it is no easy task to be good, for in everything it is no easy task to find the middle. Wherefore goodness is both rare and laudable and noble. From Book 2, Chapter 9, to hit the mean is hard in the extreme. We must incline sometimes toward the excess, sometimes toward the deficiency, for so shall we most easily hit the mean and what is right. Also from Chapter 9, we must consider the things towards which we ourselves are easily carried away, for some of us tend to one thing, some to another. From Ethics, Book 3, Chapter 4, perhaps the good man differs from others most by seeing the truth in each class of things. In most things, the error seems to be due to pleasure, for it appears good when it is not. We therefore choose the pleasant as a good and avoid pain as an evil. Regarding knowing about virtue versus acting in a virtuous way, Aristotle claims that three things are necessary. First, we must have knowledge of the virtues. Second, we must choose the acts and choose them for their own sakes. That is, that of being the right thing to do. And third, our actions must proceed from a firm and unchangeable character. Of the three, he observes, knowledge has little or no weight, while the other conditions count not a little, but for everything. And he then warns, and this is in Ethics, Book 2, Chapter 4, but most people do not do these, but take refuge in theory and think they are being philosophers and will become good in this way, behaving somewhat like patients who listen attentively to their doctors, but do none of the things they are ordered to do. As the latter will not be made well in body by such a course of treatment, the former will not be made well in soul by such a course in philosophy. The next section is on the danger of vice, which of course is the deficiency or the excess. This first quote is from Ethics, Book 6, Chapter 5. The man who has been ruined by pleasure or pain forthwith fails to see any such originating cause, for vice is destructive of the originating cause of action. That's one of the most powerful quotes from Ethics, in my opinion, that choosing wrong makes you less able to choose right in the future. Scary stuff. From Ethics, Book 3, Chapter 2, the incontinent man acts with appetite, not with choice. From Ethics 4, 5, evil destroys even itself, and if it is complete, becomes unbearable. From Ethics, Book 7, Chapter 8, for virtue and vice respectively preserve and destroy the first principle of happiness. Virtue, either natural or produced by habitation, is what teaches right opinion about the first principle. So it seems that the more rightly you act, the more rightly you know how to act. It gets better and better. Most people are slaves of their pleasures. The question we must ask then is, how would we determine whether or not an act is virtuous? And here Aristotle argues that something exists within each of us that acts as a guide. He calls this guide reason, sometimes translated as right rule or right reason. So here we turn to reason as the path to virtue. The first quote is from Ethics Book 3, Chapter 5. One must be born with an eye, as it were, by which to judge rightly and choose what is truly good. And he is well endowed by nature who is well endowed with this. For it is what is greatest and most noble, and what we cannot get or learn from another, but must have just such as it was given us at birth. Ethics 10, Chapter 7. Happiness is an activity in accordance with the highest virtue, and this will be that of the best thing in us, whether it be reason or something else that is this element which is thought to be our natural ruler and guide, and to take thought of things noble and divine, whether it be itself also divine or only the most divine element in us. The activity of this is in accordance with the proper virtue which will be perfect happiness. That this activity is contemplative, we have already said. Reason is the best thing in us, and the objects of reason are the best of noble objects. That's from Ethics, Book 10, Chapter 7. Regarding the complete happiness of man, Aristotle said, and this is coming from Ethics, Book 10, verse 7, or Chapter 7, such a life would be too high for man, for it is not insofar as he is man that he will live so, but insofar as something divine is present in him. If reason is divine, then in comparison with man, the life according to it is divine in comparison with the human life. But we must not follow those who advise us, being men, to think of human things, and being mortal, of mortal things, but must, so far as we can, make ourselves immortal, and strain every nerve to live in accordance with the best thing in us. For even if it be small in bulk, much more it does in power and worth surpass everything. For man, therefore, the life according to reason is best and pleasantest, since reason, more than anything else, is man. This life, therefore, is also the happiest. Got to live according to conscience. Short quote from Ethics 1 regarding the good. Every art and every inquiry, and similarly every action and pursuit, is thought to aim at some good, and for this reason the good has been rightly declared to be that at which all things aim. Then we move into the state and political science, and quotes on those subjects. And this first one is from Ethics, Book 1, Chapter 2. If, then, there is some end of the things we do, which we desire for its own sake, everything else being desired for the sake of this, clearly this must be the good and chief good, the most authoritative art, most truly the master art, and politics appear to be of this nature, for it is this that ordains which of the sciences should be studied in the state, so that this end must be the good for man. For even if the end is the same for a single man and for a state, that of the state seems at all events something greater and more complete, whether to attain or to preserve. Though it is worthwhile to attain the end merely for one man, it is finer and more godlike to attain it for a man or for city-states. This is political science, in one sense of that term. Ethics, Book 1, Chapter 4. Let us resume our inquiry and state in view of the fact that all knowledge in every pursuit aims at some good, what it is that we say political science aims at, and what is the highest of all goods achievable by action. Verbally, there is very general agreement, for both the general run of men and people of superior refinement say that it is happiness. From Ethics, Book 1, Chapter 9, political science spends most of its pains on making the citizens to be of a certain character, that is, good and capable of noble acts. From Ethics, Book 1, Chapter 13, the student of politics, then, must study the soul, and must study it with these objects, virtue and happiness, in view. That's fascinating to me, that the student of politics should be studying virtue and happiness. Fascinating stuff. This next quote is from Ethics, Book 2, Chapter 1. Neither by nature, then, nor contrary to nature, do the virtues arise in us. Rather, we are adapted by nature to receive them, and are made perfect by habit. This is confirmed by what happens in states, for legislators make the citizens good by forming habits in them, and this is the wish of every legislator. And those who do not effect it miss their mark, and it is in this that a good constitution differs from a bad one. From Ethics, Book 5, Chapter 2, the majority of the acts commanded by the law are those which are prescribed from the point of view of virtue taken as a whole. For the law bids us practice every virtue and forbids us to practice any vice. And the things that tend to produce virtue taken as a whole are those of the acts prescribed by the law which have been prescribed with a view to education for the common good. Ethics, Book 9, Chapter 6. Bad men aim at getting more than their share of advantages, while in labor and public service they fall short of their share, and each man wishing for advantage to himself criticizes his neighbors and stands in his way. For if people do not watch it carefully, the common weal is soon destroyed. The common well-being is what the common will refers to. The result is that they are in a state of faction, putting compulsion on each other, but unwilling to do that which is just. And the Federalist Papers get into that a ton. That's you can see a direct line from Aristotle to Hamilton and Madison. From politics, the end of the state is the good life, and these are the means towards it. And the state is the union of families and villages in a perfect and self-sufficing life, by which we mean a happy and honorable life. On the soul, from Ethics, Book 1, Chapter 7, the function of man is an activity of the soul. And from the same chapter, the function of man is a certain kind of life, and this is to be an activity or actions of the soul implying a rational principle. And the function of a good man to be the good and the noble performance of these, human good, turns out to be activity of the soul in accordance with virtue. Regarding property and the complete life, from Politics, Book 1, Chapter 4. Property is a part of the household, and the art of acquiring property is a part of the art of managing the household, for no man can live well, or indeed live at all, unless he be provided with necessities. From Ethics, Book 10, Chapter 3, wealth is desirable, but not as the reward of betrayal. From Politics 7:1, some think that a very moderate amount of virtue is enough, but set no limit to their desires of wealth, property, power, reputation, and the like. To whom we reply by an appeal to facts, which easily prove that mankind do not acquire or preserve virtue by the help of external goods, but external goods by the help of virtue, and that happiness, whether consisting in pleasure or virtue, or both, is more often found with those who are most highly cultivated in their mind and in their character and have only a moderate share of external goods, than among those who possess external goods to a useless extent but are deficient in higher qualities. That's from Politics 7:1. From Politics 7, also 7:1, let us acknowledge then that each has just so much of happiness as he has of virtue and wisdom and of virtuous and wise action. God is a witness to us of this truth, for he is happy and blessed, not by reason of any external good, but in himself and by reason of his own nature. And herein of necessity lies the difference between good fortune and happiness. For external goods come of themselves, and chance is the author of them, but no one is just or temperate by or through chance. In like manner, and by a similar train of argument, the happy state may be shown to be that which is best and which acts rightly, and rightly it cannot act without doing right actions, and neither individual nor state can do right actions without virtue and wisdom. Thus, the courage, justice, and wisdom of a state have the same form and nature as the qualities which give the individual who possesses them the name of just, wise, or temperate. Let us assume then that the best life for both individuals and states is the life of virtue, when virtue has external goods, property, enough for the performance of good actions. And that was from Politics 7:1. From Politics 2:5, it is clearly better that property should be private, but the use of it common, and special business of the legislator is to create in men this benevolent disposition. And further, there is the greatest pleasure in doing a kindness or service to friends or guests or companions, which can only be rendered when a man has private property. No one, when men have all things in common, will any longer set an example of liberality or do any liberal action, for liberality exists in the use which is made of property. A relevant quote from Hamilton in Federalist 79 is, "In the general course of human nature, a power over man's subsistence amounts to a power over his will." That last quote from Politics is so powerful, showing that there is all the difference in the world between property given through generosity, through one's own will and desire freely, compared to that when it's given coercively, when it's taken from you to give to someone else. It's a completely, the end result might be the same, but what it does to the people involved is completely different. On education, from Ethics, Book 2, Chapter 1. It makes no small difference then whether we form habits of one kind or another from our very youth. It makes a very great difference, or rather, all the difference. Fantastic quote. Ethics 10:1. In educating the young, we steer them by the rudders of pleasure and pain. Ethics 10:9. It is hard, if not impossible, to remove by argument the traits that have long since been incorporated in the character. It's easier to raise a boy than fix a man, is another way of saying that. Powerful quote. From Ethics 10:9. The soul of the student must first have been cultivated by means of habits for noble joy and noble hatred, like earth which is to nourish the seed. For he who lives as passion directs will not hear argument that dissuades him, nor understand it if he does. And how can we persuade one in such a state to change his ways? And in general, passion seems to yield not to argument but to force. The character, then, must somehow be there already with a kinship to virtue, loving what is noble and hating what is base. But it is difficult to get from youth up a right training for virtue if one has not been brought up under the right laws. For to live temperately and heartily is not pleasant to most people, especially when they are young. For this reason, their nurture and occupations should be fixed by law, for they will not be painful when they have become customary. But it is surely not enough that when they are young they should get the right nurture and attention, since they must, even when they are grown up, practice and be habituated to them. We shall need laws for this as well, and generally speaking to cover the whole of the life, for most people obey necessity rather than argument, and punishments rather than the sense of what is noble. That's from Ethics 10:9. And I think we learned a lot over the subsequent 2,000 years until the founding on it would be fantastic if we could always know that the laws we set in terms of education and child rearing could always be the right ones. And the problem is that we can't. And so I think we've learned that in that sense, I disagree with Aristotle. And we have to place that power in the people. Also from Ethics 10:9, private education has an advantage over public. As a boxer presumably does not prescribe the same style of fighting to all his pupils, it would seem then that the details worked out with more precision if the control is private, for each person is more likely to get what suits his case. And finally, on the subject of godliness, from Ethics 1:9. That which is the prize and end of virtue seems to be the best thing in the world, and something godlike and blessed. From Ethics 10:8. Therefore, the activity of God, which surpasses all other in blessedness, must be contemplative, and of human activities, therefore, that which is most akin to this must be most of the nature of happiness. From also 10:8, we assume the gods to be above all other beings blessed and happy. And also from 10:8, happiness is an activity of the soul that is excellent in all of the ways a human thinks or acts. Now he who exercises his reason and cultivates it seems to be both in the best state of mind and most dear to the gods. For if the gods have any care for human affairs, as they are thought to have, it would be reasonable both that they should delight in that which was best and most akin to them, reason, and that they should reward those who love and honor this most, as caring for the things that are dear to them, and acting both rightly and nobly. And that all these attributes belong most of all to the philosopher is manifest. He therefore is the dearest to the gods, and he who is that will presumably be also the happiest, so that in this way too the philosopher will be more than any other be happy. That concludes the quotes that I had selected, the excerpts from Aristotle's Ethics and Politics. Just one personal note is that it's very difficult to read Aristotle. It's very jam-packed. It's a different language. It's very old, obviously, 2,300 years, and translated from another language. So it's much like Shakespeare or Scripture, where you have to read it over and over again until it becomes familiar. It does get easier, but it hasn't ever gotten easy, at least not for me. But I've had to read things. I think I've read Ethics at least 3 times in terms of reading it over and over, trying to understand what is being said. And so if you, dear listener, are struggling to fully comprehend the quotes that I shared with you, know that they were extracted after multiple exposures to myself before I fully felt that I fully understood them and could bring them out and share them. And so I think that you'll find it very useful to review them multiple times, and ideally in the written form. Aristotle, for me at least, is difficult to listen to. I have to really be reading it alone in quiet and solitude and thinking carefully about what is being read. But it's been a remarkable experience reading Aristotle's Ethics. I read it once many years ago and got a certain set out of it, and this second and third time that I've read it more recently, it's been powerful to see that someone like Jefferson could extract this idea of happiness and its pursuit and to understand that there's a whole science, so to speak, with regards to what the pursuit of happiness really is, and that the philosophers and thinkers who followed Aristotle, Cicero and Locke and others, built upon that foundation, combined it with Christianity, and formed the greatest nation that's ever existed. And I write and record this on America's birthday, for the 4th of July, and am very grateful for that foundation and how different America is from any nation that's come before it. We have our flaws and our faults, to be sure, and much of what was originally intended has been corrupted, in my opinion. But it is still the greatest hope for mankind and for our world. Thanks for listening.